Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video number 87 and audio season 4, episode 28 of Music is Not a Genre. Thank you as always for watching and listening. Don't forget you can support this podcast on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. The audio version is at anchor.fm/musicisnotagenre from where it is distributed everywhere. My public hub is youtube.com/Nick DiMatteo, and you can see almost everything there. And as I mentioned last week, at nickdimatteo.com, if you go to nickdimatteo.com/podcast, you will see the developing page of the home of Music is Not a Genre, where you can find everything about this podcast. Keep checking it. You'll see me adding things each week. Let's get to the topic this week. We are in book talk number 2, official book talk number 2. Yes, this is the third book I've discussed, but it is the second episode dedicated solely to talking about a book. And the topic is Major Labels, A History of Popular Music in 7 Genres. This is where it gets personal. So when you review, I have a lot swirling in my head this week. And it's because I've been, as usual, making changes and upgrades and researching and doing things that globally end up affecting the podcast. And I, as part of that, reviewed other music podcasters. Review meaning just kind of took a look at them and absorbed them and got an idea of what they do. 5 other podcasters on YouTube in particular. And was impressed, What I like about what everyone is doing, including here at Music is Not a Genre, is that we're all doing something different. What struck me was that, on the whole, with a couple exceptions, those other podcasters are coming at it from, I'll say, the standpoint of a music lover, a music listener, fan, and that's great. And it's going to bear on what I'm talking about with this book here. This is why I'm bringing this up. None of them are what I would call music insiders, meaning they haven't made a living at music, creating music constantly. My entire creative life is informed by the music that I have done since I was a child. And a lot of what I do is and has been in the music industry. And I think that's what differentiates this podcast from other podcasts, is that I am coming at it from an insider perspective, and it changes how you talk about things. It changes how you talk about music. It changes how you talk about music criticism. It changes how you discuss and what you focus on. Not to mention there are decisions I make as to how I talk and what I bring into the conversation that are just a personal, preference. And this is where it gets personal, just like the title said here. And that's because you may not know this, because I tend to be pretty even-tempered when I'm doing these podcasts, but I'm a very emotional person. I get easily affected by pretty much everything, very sensitive. And especially when it comes to discussing something that I love. Especially that. If it's something I dislike and you like it, okay, there's a difference of opinion there, but it doesn't strike me as much. If there is a type of music or a band or a song that I love and I find that someone else doesn't like it, it used to be that it would trigger me. And I know that's a word that is used often, but it would get to me to a point where I didn't know how to relate to that person. And, you grow and age and experience and all that stuff, and you learn that if you take a breath and try to understand it from that person's perspective and what they're getting at, and the fact that it's really no insult or threat to you that someone has a difference of opinion, then you're listening more and you're exploring and understanding more. And that's, I think, what we're trying to get at here. And so I have learned to temper my initial emotional reactions with that desire to want to connect and understand. Another thing I find that is different about this podcast, and that's all I'll say. And that works especially well when you're confronted by a person of equal passion, whose opinions may differ from yours. like Kelefasane, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. I believe I got the pronunciation from him, a video that he did, so fingers crossed that one's right. This is an absolutely passionate person. His passion for music and music criticism and the writing of it, the discussing of it is palpable. It's everywhere. It's in every word. It's on every page of this book in particular. And if you've read any of his other reviews or seen any of his videos, you will notice the same thing. This is someone who is absolutely in love with music, and he is experienced and informed, and he has a lot of strong opinions. And those opinions do not necessarily jibe with mine, in every case. I will say this about this book: I was surprised how often I agreed, and I'll go through the reasons later on as to why that happened. But starting out with the book, I was predisposed to skepticism because a good friend of mine who is also an excellent writer and critic of music, and he's actually creating his own music now, Steve Erickson, he mentioned to me from the outset, he had read the book months before I did, and he wanted my take on it. So, Steve, if you're watching or listening, this is my take, that Kelefasane defends genre boundaries. And so immediately, coming from, the creator of Music Is Not a Genre, you can imagine that pushed some buttons before I even picked up the book. But the book was too fascinating, and, I read good reviews, and even Steve himself enjoyed the book, for me to pass up. So I knew it was inevitable that I would get it, I would read it. And like I said, it was a close call, but overall I really enjoyed it. And let me be very clear, and the reason why it was a close call was not because it is in any way a bad book, and let me be even clearer in that I don't do traditional reviews. I don't, I am not a critic, and that is by choice. It doesn't mean in my personal life I don't, it's like I said, I'm an emotional person, and you say things and feel things. But that when you're trying to communicate and trying to really get at the understanding of something, and especially in this venue where I'm connecting with you and an audience where I want that kind of discussion to happen, this is never about me declaiming this music sucks, or this music is amazing, or this music is objectively good or bad, or this book is objectively good or bad. I will tell you a million times that if I voice an opinion, that it is an opinion, and it might be informed, it might be, educated, it might be from a lot of experience, just like the author here, but I will in no way claim to be an expert or the final word, other than in a few cases, and you've heard me say those things, and I will probably say them again. And so all of that kind of floating around in my head when I started to read this book made it a little tough for me to get into it at first, because I was fighting with myself. And that's never a good place to come from. This kind of predisposition to skepticism is a prejudgment, which is prejudice. So I had a prejudice against this book before I read it. And I had to do my best to clear that out and take the book at face value in order to really understand it and appreciate it for what it is. And I was able to do that eventually, and I think it was in part because of the author's passion and how relentless he is at digging into every corner and in his own way connecting things, and especially connecting things to himself. And I believe other reviewers have said this. My friend Steve has said this. And this is one thing that really struck me when I read it. And that is the book came alive the most when he was being personal. When he tied the music and his experience of the music to his own life and to his personal story and upbringing and all of that. It's not to say that his history wasn't also very on. Although when he kind of weighed in and gave his opinion, there were times where there were times where that opinion was like, oh wow, I never thought of it that way, and it kind of gave a new perspective on things. And there were other times where I'm like, no, that comes from a certain perspective that is his, that is not necessarily shared, by everyone or by me. And again, what saved that is the fact that it's such a personal book and a personally affecting book. And he claims, and I believe that he's right about this, that he is in a sense an outsider, and it's both because he professes that he doesn't really have much musical ability, although he was in a band once, and so doesn't consider himself a musical insider in that sense. And also his race and where he and his family come from, and kind of coming into the culture in that way, although he grew up here and all of that and is an American, but that will naturally change your perspective of things. And because of that, and because it was so clear about that, it was easier for me to understand why we might disagree on certain things. And some of those things I'm going to get into later, as a matter of fact. So let me state here, as I mentioned it before, why, even though in some ways this was a close call for me, and this is how this goes, right? I read a lot of music books. I actually have read more music books recently than I have pretty much ever. And the majority of them are nonfiction, and the majority of them are history in some way of something. Not all of them, but some, in the most cases. And other books, with one exception, which I hope to get to this season, which is that History of Progressive Rock that I keep mentioning. That's the exception, but all the other books tend to be like textbooks in a sense. They're engaging, and they're written by people who have experienced this music and are informed in whatever histories they have. Last Night a DJ Saved My Life is a perfect example, and that's a book that I'll bring up again a little bit later. This book, the reason why it was a little bit of a gray area is because it presents itself as a history. It has a lot of history. And because I read other books on some of the subjects in this book, maybe I overlooked some of the history that he gave because I kind of was familiar with it already. But that is to say that if you want kind of an overview of these genres, the 7 genres, which I'll mention later, you wouldn't hurt you to pick up this book, with the caveat that not every observation that he makes is one that is necessarily what you would consider accepted wisdom or the way other historians see music. Doesn't take away from the quality of the book. That said, there were 3 things about this book that saved it for me, that really saved it. And the first one, and I keep saying this, he knows his stuff. Whether it's through his own personal experience, particularly in the section about punk, which I think was the most vibrant and best section of the book, or his professional experience as someone who went out as a job and listened to music, whether it was at a record store or live, and wrote about it and all of that, and continues to do that. You can tell that he knows his stuff. I keep wanting to say inside and out, but again, he really is kind of an outsider to this in the way that most critics are, and that's the word. I keep using that word on purpose, and I think I mentioned this recently in another podcast, but there's a difference between criticism and critique in my mind, and this might just be the way I define them, but to me, a critic is somebody who pulls things apart in a way that kind of takes them down, with no other global objective than to weigh in as an expert. And someone who gives a critique kind of comes at it in a sense, even if it's not from the inside, from their experience, but tries to get inside the material and appreciate it for what it is. It may still have some issues with it, but, you know, respects it, I guess, is you know, and I'm going to be doing another episode, possibly this season, an opinion episode on something that he brought up in this book, which has to do with the idea of negative reviews being a bad thing all of a sudden. And I'm of two minds about that, and I'll expand a lot on this in that future episode. But just to quickly go over that, yes, you should never go into reviewing, if you're a reviewer, already deciding you love or hate something, or only review things that you are predisposed to like. Or, even worse, always try to write a positive review, even if it's something, you know, that doesn't strike you that way. Now, I'm not sure where he or other people get the idea that negative reviews are frowned upon, because I've seen a ton of them. I mean a ton. I don't necessarily think that they are frowned upon. I think that promoters and the PR are going to push the positive forward first, but that doesn't mean that there aren't reviewers out there giving negative reviews. And the second point about this is that I tend to be turned off by reviewers whose sole purpose is to trash something. You know, I'll give an example. I will probably never, I'm not a reviewer, but if I were a reviewer, I will never write a review of a mainstream country music album, because I'm sure much of that music is really super well done and it's very respected, and there's some great singer-songwriters, performers, and the whole thing, you know, and that whole Nashville crew who does most of the music. But it's not my kind of music. So it would be my inclination to see the flaws before I see the good things about it. And that's not fair. And if you're a reviewer and what you're doing is you're jumping in almost, I think, intentionally to pull flaws out of things and to just take it apart, then that to me is a power play. That to me is a kind of a play of superiority. Like, I know better than the people who created this. And I think that's the difference between also an outsider and an insider, which is to say that if I were asked to play bass on a Nashville session, or was sitting in on one, or heard an interview with an artist about their music, there's a chance I'm going to feel it a lot more because I come at it from the inside than someone who hasn't had experiences like that. So that's my tangent there. So the second thing that saved this book for me was that he's a guy who's close to my age, a few years younger, so he's been around a while, and he's very honest about the fact that he has often made what ended up being very incorrect assessments of music. So he's honest about how wrong his opinions have been. Perfect example, when Beyonce released her first album, Ashanti also released an album, and he went on record as saying that Ashanti's was superior and that she would go on to big things and be super popular. We all know how, which one of those artists has been favored historically since then, and I think rightfully so. And he's very honest about the fact that he missed that, And he's also honest about his own personal bias and vantage point. And so even though there are times where I disagree, I don't see it his way, I think that maybe some of the angles he's taking on certain things don't really ring true when he talks about how he comes at it from his own perspective and his experience, it mitigates that. And that to me is a sign of an evolved, artist. And a great example is how he wrote how bands have a right to defy critical consensus. That's my paraphrase. But Grand Funk Railroad was his example, and he wrote about how they were trashed left and right in the 70s, but were one of the most successful rock bands of the 70s. Now, I will confess that I've probably heard several of their songs and wouldn't be able to name one of them. And that doesn't make it good or bad music. There were those songs I remember being good. I don't think that they were by any means the best band of the 70s, but at the time, like he said, they were more successful than almost any, I think maybe almost any other rock band when they were at their height of popularity. And so no matter what the critics say, which can be a good and bad thing. On the one hand, right, critics know what they know, and the only critics I respect are the ones who are honest about the fact that they don't know shit. Because I say that all the time. I know what I know, but ultimately, what do I really know? And at the same time, when you agree with a critic, you agree. And so I think historically, we might want to paint with a different brush or hindsight and all of that. And when it comes to a band like Grand Funk Railroad, when you are dealing with bands that were not as mainstream popular as you might think in the 70s, like Led Zeppelin and such, we see historically in how the type of music they made, what was it doing to change the conversation of music, et cetera, or how do the songs hold up? And you might look back and say, well, Led Zeppelin was just a far superior band. And in some ways they were. And I'm sure there are people who will say in some ways Grand Funk Railroad was. The third thing that saved this book for me, and this is where it gets personal again, is that, like I mentioned, he's pretty close to my generation. He's only a few years younger, so he's a Gen Xer. And so he has some similar touchstones and perspectives about certain things. When it came, especially, I think hip hop was my second favorite section in this book. And I think that because of that, it was as though I was reading a book from a friend from high school, even though, as many years apart as we are, we wouldn't have attended high school at the same time, but it's close enough as time goes on. And that we'd be having a discussion and I'd find out that I really like this person, but our tastes are just quite different. We might agree on a few things, like a lot of what he said about, some of what he said about punk, I'll say, and some of what he said about hip hop. But then we'll tend to disagree on quite a few other things. But it was cool to kind of feel that generational kinship, I guess is what I'm saying. A perfect example of a disagreement that comes from his, I think his, like he said, his personal bias. My friend pointed out that he said that he found that the author said that he found something appealing and even exotic about the whiteness he saw in both punk and country. Now, there would be nothing exotic about that for me or other white people, right? Because that's the definition, of something like that, exotic or different. It's not you. But because Kelafasana comes from a different background, it's understandable that there was this sort of club feel to those types of music in particular. And you could argue in many eras of rock, even though historically it's incorrect, even though historically country, is incorrectly assumed to be an invention of white people when it wasn't. But you can see how you could make that distinction and say, oh, okay, these are predominantly white. And yeah, there were bands like Bad Brains in the punk world, Charlie Pride in the country music world, and so many others in both cases. But yes, those genres in their prime and since, or well, maybe not now, but in their prime especially, and for decades, were overwhelmingly white. I can sort of understand why he'd find that appealing, and it's an interesting perspective, but it almost to me seems like a challenge or kind of I'm going to say something controversial And he did kind of, unravel it a little bit and explain it more. But that could also be because I'm responding kind of, I'm triggered by that because, in many cases, in the fact that those are, largely white in terms of what's popular, especially, is right. It doesn't mean that all the artists were or are white, but that's how they're perceived, and that in their own ways they were very divisive. There were certain strains of punk, and there's many strains of punk, but there were certain ones that were very exclusive, that even dismissed other forms of punk, and those groups also dismissed, quite probably people of a different color or background. And in country music, try as it might, and it's trying really hard now, it's had an understandably hard time shaking off the mantle of being racist. And that's not to say by any means that most country music is racist or the artists are, but it is often very aggressively marketed to white people. And a lot of the lyrics and experiences trend in that direction. And that is changing. And there have been differences throughout history, but it's changing even more so now. But there's an example of where I couldn't really understand his perspective, but you could kind of see why. And to kind of, pop one more, note into the book on the whole, and I think other people have said this, I wish it was just a memoir. I wish it was a memoir of my life in 7 genres and that kind of a thing, because even though the history was interesting and he absolutely has the authority and experience to write it, those personal elements, and then maybe he'll write another book where you can get even more personal about this stuff, were just so affecting that you wanted to know more. In every case, in any of the genres, yes, especially punk and secondly hip hop, but really even when you say things like that about country music, you're like, tell me more about you. Don't try to interpret country music history right now. That doesn't seem to be where the real strength of the book is. Just tell me more about you and your relationship with the music. That's what really got me with this. So just to kind of quickly go over the structure of the book, other than an intro, and I think there was an ender there, but the 7 genres in order that are name-checked in the title: rock, R&B, country, punk, hip-hop, dance, and pop. And I've mentioned punk, strongest, hip-hop second, which it felt like punk to him in some ways, and I think that it's been said about hip-hop that is, it was sort of the punk R&B or punk disco of its time, and you can see why. The dance, I recently read that book last night. A DJ Saved My Life, so a lot of what he went over was something that I had read before. But I think if this is your first exposure to that history, it's damn good. Rock and R&B and country, a lot of, let's say, interesting facts that popped up that I didn't know, like that fact about Grand Funk Railroad being so successful. But overall, didn't necessarily, I didn't have a lot of takeaways that I guess stuck with me. Pop, my favorite thing about the pop section is that he pointed out that pop as a genre, meaning as produced in an exclusive way, in a way to be its own thing, didn't actually really emerge until the early 80s and took over the airwaves. And it was in large part because of the second British invasion with all the new romantic, new wave bands. And I think he name-checked Culture Club. And there were many bands who, this was their sort of, punk was a rebellion, and this was their rebellion from punk and from rock in general, to say that it was not just okay to be pop, it was cool to be pop. And that was not necessarily the conventional wisdom. It wasn't for, I think, maybe until really the 90s. It took a while for it to really sink in. But during the 80s and certainly prior, in music circles, if you were called pop, that was kind of looked down upon. And as you know, as I've said before, there's excellent quality, good, awful, all kinds of music in every single type, music, every single genre. But the fact that he is pointing out that pop sort of rose and said it deserves respect, and it was all of a sudden being created by these auteurs like Boy George and all of them, that has continued to such a degree to this day that when I think of it was almost 10 years ago now, somebody that I used to know by Gautier is like, indie pop is now its own genre. And indie pop is all of a sudden, with people like MxG, becoming like just pop. And yet, and you can hear it in my voice as I start to talk about this, but I do want to, one last thing about that is I love the fact that, he shows that pop should be respected like any other, type, because as you know, I agree with that, since most of what I do is some version of that. But it does get to the larger point, which is the idea of genres. And it was a good enough book that I just was not upset by the fact that he was very adamant about how much he loves genres and how sort of upset he gets at people who disparage them. And his passion and his joy in defining genres and in embracing genre boundaries, as if to say, well, here's a set of rules. Apply those rules to your music and get them as best you can and really create the perfect representation of that genre. I understand that because there's a place for that. There is absolutely a place for that. But I think it's a very, very, very small percentage of music that can be classified into one single genre. I think a very small percentage. And he understands that. The author understands that there's fluidity in genres. And, I guess the part that I kind of disagree with it is that he seems so enamored of genre boundaries and genre restrictions. And that could be partly from an outsider perspective, although I'm sure there are many musicians, but most musicians will tell you that if they're going to be confined, it's because they're confining themselves. They don't want anybody to tell them, well, you're doing, X kind of like R&B music, so it can't have a distorted guitar, or you're doing rock music, so it can't have electronic drums, or whatever it is that has traditionally been thought to not be a part of that genre. Musicians will tell you, no, it's actually not fun. And even though I have a load fun time going into subcategories and sub-classifications of, there's punk, but there's post-punk, but then there's emo, but then there's screamo, and then how far down the chain can you get? There's probably divisions of screamo that I don't even know about. That's kind of cool and kind of fun, but ultimately it disproves its own rule, which is to say that you could divide every single song almost into a separate genre. So what's the point, of having them in the first place? And yes, they do what they're supposed to do, which is to give us an in to what we might encounter. It sets expectations, but they do a lot more. They segregate, they shut out a ton of people by virtue of their name. He had a problem with alt country because it's like, why does it have to be alt? And, it was trying to be, I guess, in a sense, more clever than country. I, of course, disagree with that because I'm not a fan of mainstream country. But there's a lot of alt country that, I don't listen to either. But the point is, why should you disparage that? Why shouldn't there be a place for saying, well, country says you can only do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to add, Q, P, and W into that too. And it's going to be totally awesome. And so what, And, that is kind of where I land with the idea of that. So ultimately, I guess, as fun as it was to go through all of this, I kind of disagree with the premise. And I'm happy to say that I believe that we are looking, and I see this book as a summation of what I'll call the hyper-genre divided era of music, which I think has been slowly eroding, and we're seeing it in its death throes, largely because of the internet and the people saying, well, I like this music, but I also like this music, and I like this, and I don't even know what it is. And I think that the fact that this sort of serves as this is what music was like, almost, makes it very valuable to me, because I would love to think that in 10 years, somebody's going to read this and say, wow, that was a shitload of segregation, or however you want to, phrase that. As far as, music of mine, I mean, I'm reviewing a book, so what, as my first thought, I would love to say, here's a song that I recorded that incorporates all 7 of these genres that are named in this book. And as a matter of fact, in my upcoming album, there is one song that will probably have, if not all of them, the most of them, because that's how I hear it. It's, it's somewhat of a challenge to myself, but it's mostly because that's how this song is supposed to be unfolding, and it may take a turn and go completely different, because I don't want to prejudge it and predetermine it, I should say. But that song doesn't exist yet. So instead, I'm going to share with you links to 2 things. One is my Band Rex album, The Sunshine Seminar, because my last project was a variation of 5 albums with different, genres and types of music, and somewhat classified. The Sunshine Seminar, I think, is more singularly representative of what Rec does, because it is an album that incorporates almost everything that I do in any, genre or subgenre. And I, in fact, defy you and challenge Kele Fasane to classify the album. Say, what kind of music is that other than indie? Because that's pretty broad. And so that's what I'm throwing up here as a representation. And because I don't want to play the entire album at the end of this podcast, but I do want a song to be featured, as always, I'm going to feature the final song on the album. It's called Brave the World. And this is in honor of this wonderful author, because punk music was his professed favorite music for many, many years, if not still. And Brave the World is one of my entries into the punk world, and I think you will get that immediately when you start listening to it. And very shortly, as soon as I'm done talking here, which is soon. So have you read this book? And if so, what did you think of it? Do you know any of the author's other works? I'd love to know that. What's your take on the author in general? What are your feelings about genres past, genres present, and the future of genres? How do you relate to music criticism? I haven't had enough discussion about this. I'd love to hear more from people about how they feel, because you don't just accept something that's written, critique it yourself. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? It's not God's word. It's just somebody opining on something. I want to know that, and anything else you're thinking, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for listening and watching, and I will talk to you next week.